Hello, very good morning. You're watching Sky News Breakfast. A reminder of our top stories here today. And extra police deployed in London through the night in case of violence and to guard the cenotaph ahead of Remembrance Sunday events later on this morning. It follows more than 120 arrests on Armistice Day yesterday, mostly far-right counter-protesters, as hundreds of thousands took part in a pro-Palestinian march. Yesterday's scenes have maintained pressure on the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, who's been accused of whipping up divisions. Meanwhile, inside Gaza, the World Health Organization says it's lost contact with the Al-Shifa hospital, saying it's gravely concerned for people trapped there by fighting. And an entire fishing village is evacuated in Iceland, where scientists expect a volcanic eruption any time in the next few days. So let's take a look at the front pages of Sunday morning's papers now, which are dominated by the Armistice Day protests and tensions. The Observer writes, calls grow for Israel to hold fire in Gaza as marchers throng London. Dignity and Dishonour is the Sunday Express headline, saying extremists from the left and right marched for hate as the nation paused to remember the war dead. The Sunday Mirror focuses on Suella Braverman with the splash, "Sack her now." The Mail on Sunday focuses on Levelling Up Secretary Michael Gove being jostled and confronted by pro-Palestinian protesters. The Sunday Telegraph echoes condemnation from Rishi Sunak. Far-right thugs and Hamas sympathisers disrespect our heroes. The Sunday Times takes a similar approach, reporting hate, intolerance and arrests as thugs hijack Armistice Day. And the Sun on Sunday goes with a single word headline, despicable. And here with me now to go through the newspapers are Christian Calgi, who's senior political correspondent at the Daily Express, and journalist Benjamin Buttonworth. So good to see both of you. Thanks so much for coming in. Front pages all dominated by yesterday's protests and the trouble around them. Christian, you're going to kick us off with the Sunday Times and how they've reflected on what was some pretty ugly scenes yesterday.
Yes, hate, intolerance and thugs being the main string that runs through most of these. I think it's a fairly even-handed report. Most of them this morning do lead with the far-right aspect because they made up the vast bulk of the arrests yesterday. But it also talks about Sadiq Khan's response, which he accuses the scenes of being a direct result of Suella Braverman's words, and also gives some examples of the vile anti-Semitism that you also saw from the Palestinian side of things, with people dressing up as Hamas terrorists and comparing Gaza to Auschwitz.
Yes, and the elements of the march, I mean, that there were estimates, I think the police estimated 300,000 pro-Palestinian marchers, but there were elements amongst there that were obviously causing problems, and police are still investigating some of those allegations, aren't they?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there were 100,000 at the other one, so this one was considerably bigger, no doubt fueled by the conversation around whether it was acceptable to have the protest in the first place. And I think there is a lot of concern because, you know, of course, when you have 300,000 people, the vast majority are there for entirely reasonable conclusions. But you know, anyone that looks on social media and sees the video clips of some of the things said, you know, appalling things about Hitler was right being said on the streets of London. And I think that, you know, you have to ask the police serious questions, because they said on the previous one that it was very hard to go in and do arrests, that they were using footage to have intelligence afterwards to follow people up. But, you know, if you're a Jewish person trying to go about your life on a Sunday, seeing placards and hearing things like that is going to make London inaccessible, and I think that's a big problem.
And I do think that's a couple of key points there, which is that from what I saw, both in real life and on social media, a lot of the pro-Palestinian scenes that became violent happened later on into the evening. So that's an issue with deadlines in terms of how this is being reported. And the other problem is that when you have 300,000 people, you do get into this situation where the police are having to do retrospective investigation. So I do think that the arrest numbers are not representative.
It may not be the final numbers.
It's not the final numbers, and it's not, certainly from what I've seen, there were there was hate and intolerance pretty much equally across both sides.
I mean, you do see on social media now the police have put out messages with images they've seen on social media saying, "Can you identify this person? We're investigating hate crimes," and so they are following up. They say on those issues.
The very fact that so many people, a small number relative to 300,000, but still so many people feel that they can say those things, that they can have those chants, that they can write those things on a placard and leave the house. The very fact that you're in that situation in the first place is incredibly revealing. You know, if this were people making, you know, anti-black racist comments, for example, I don't think they would dare say it even if they held such atrocious views. And I think it's a concern that we've got into that situation already. And I think these people feel emboldened Saturday by Saturday.
Meanwhile, let's turn to the Sun on Sunday. Their headline is despicable. And they here say about the Prime Minister, which we'll come to later actually, EDL thugs, pro-Hamas extremists. They kind of wrap that all in on one of their subheads there as well. And, you know, really, really ugly scenes, but did the police do their job? I mean, they said that the threshold hadn't been reached for banning the march. Do you think that was the right call at the end of all of this?
Well, the police managed to get through it. I think they handled the far right slightly better than they handled the far left, insofar as there is a problem with the police at the moment, which is when there are large marches like this, it seems like their MO becomes not one of enforcing the law around hate speech, but one around maintaining the peace. And I think that is largely why they refuse to make arrests there and then, and you end up with this retrospective approach to policing, because there are fears that if they were to start going into this march, pulling people out who had offensive placards, then there would be backlash, there would be scraps. And I think that is largely the criticism that a lot on the right are making, people like Suella Braverman, is that there isn't a consistency. They were willing to go in, kettle the far right and make those arrests quite fairly, but when it came to the Palestinian protest, they're much more hands-off, and they're just concerned about not seeing clashes on the street.
Is that because of the immediate issue of the risk of disorder? They would say that some of these counter-protesters, as they've described, were there seeking trouble. They were trying to get to the cenotaph. They were having to be physically pushed back. Some of them, they said, turned up wanting a fight. So was it the kind of immediate disorder that they were trying to prevent?
Well, this is the thing. I mean, I appreciate you just quoting how they'd be referred to, but of course they're not counter-protesters. I mean, they had no good reason to be there. The Palestinian protest was some way from the cenotaph. It was at a different time of day. These were far-right thugs who wanted a fight, and they had a fight pretty quickly. Now, if you're a police officer and people are punching each other in the street, well, that's pretty easy to judge. I think, you know, Christian makes a perfectly reasonable point that, you know, when it's words rather than physical violence, they step back from that, and that I can see why people find that unfair. But, you know, I can't help but think, and I think this is the Sunday People's front page as well, that this was fueled by the rhetoric of Suella Braverman. That while those far-right yobs didn't go out there because they read her Times op and thought, oh, isn't that disgraceful, we'll go and say something, it's created an atmosphere of tension and of people being against each other that I think has been conducive to what we saw yesterday.
And we'll definitely come on to Suella Braverman, but what do you think, Benjamin? The police said that the march shouldn't be banned. They would say they kept the far right away from the cenotaph. They also would say they kept the two groups apart because there was a feeling that they were trying to get to the pro-Palestinian
march. I mean, thank God they kept them apart. But
so did they do their job?
I think, well, look, I think when it comes to the far-right stuff they did, they desperately were trying to control these thugs. There is a problem with not arresting people guilty of hate speech at the pro-Palestine marches. But the idea it should have been banned, I think, was completely wrong. You know, when it's in a different part of London, in a different time of day, you know, we talk about Armistice Day. Well, they fought for the right for people to have that freedom of speech and to have things like protest. And I think a democracy like Britain's has to be strong enough to tolerate this discomfort.
OK, let's turn to the issue of the Home Secretary, because, again, she makes the front pages once again. And the Sunday Mirror here, Christian, sack her now. And they've got a picture of Sadiq Khan. You referred to it earlier, that he said that her words, I can't remember, was it a direct result? Did he say?
Yes, the hate was a direct result of her words and behaviour, is the quote that he's given to the Mirror. I don't want to be sceptical here, but I do think that a lot of the left-wing opposition to the Home Secretary could easily have been written well before these protests happened. In many ways, I think the left were delighted that she provided a reason to excuse some of the hatred and confrontation that we saw on the streets. And the question is, to what extent did Suella Braverman's words create the counter-protests, right? Because people, by and large, in the pro-Palestinian lot were going to be marching anyway. To what extent did the EDL and other football hooligans be encouraged out by their words? And I'm afraid to say I do not buy the argument that her words put them out on the street. I mean, we at the Express splashed a front page, goodness me, at the end of last week, saying that these protests were going to be really dangerous. That was because it was blatantly obvious that a pro-Palestinian march on Armistice Day was going to bring out the far right in this way. Those were the concerns well before Suella Braverman and indeed Rishi Sunak and many other Conservative MPs and cabinet ministers started objecting to plans.
Okay, and look at the Sunday People while you have your say, Benjamin. They say, look what you've done.
Yeah.
The Sunday People have made it clear what they think. What's your...
I mean, I don't quite accept what Christian says, because anyone that was reading the newspapers that isn't familiar with the geography of London would have thought that the Palestine March was going to be in the close vicinity of the Cenotaph, and that was a potentially disrespectful thing to happen. And of course, it was never nearby and never at the same time of day. And yet Suella Braverman went out of her way to create the sense that there was a real clash, that it was almost an attack on remembering the war dead, which was never the case. And I think when she whipped up that frenzy, when she created that anxiety and fear, that created a lot of anger. Now, there's no justification. You know, I don't blame Suella Braverman for literally what these far-right yobs did, because they couldn't care less about any politician, I suspect. But she created an atmosphere of hate, which is quite ironic, given she was accusing these pro-Palestine marches of being hate marches, which again, you know, you're the Home Secretary, you're not a commentator. What is that going to do in reality? It's going to make people angry, it's going to make them defensive, it's going to make them lash out. That's where you get a situation where people are more riled than they needed to be.
Okay, well, so much around this subject to talk about. We're out of time for now, but you are both back in an hour's time for another look at the papers. But for the moment, thanks both.